Hey guys, the Middle East. It's a place not known for its stability. Almost every corner of the continent is laced in conflict. From Syria and Yemen, embroiled in an endless civil war, Turkey, unnecessarily involving themselves in Syria and Iraq dealing with 10 million militias killing each other, and Israel and Hamas in a competition to have the most war crimes committed. While all this chaos is going on, the nations of Saudi Arabia and Iran are fighting for spheres of influence to either protect their old order or to make a new one. So, why is Saudi Arabia and Iran at each other's throats? Or more accurately, angrily glaring at each other while supporting opposing sides in a conflict, turning it into a proxy conflict? Well, it all started back in the year of our Lord, 1979, when Iran had a revolution, an Islamic revolution. You see, from 1952 to 1979, Iran was ruled by the Shah, which is basically the king in Iran, who was given power by the US and UK against a popular prime minister and his democratically elected government to prevent the nationalization of Iran's oil, which would cut the UK off from an imported oil supply. The Shah ruled with absolute power and used his iron fist to destroy anyone against him, which gave him a lot of enemies, which would bite him in the ass because Islamic priests led a popular uprising against him and deposed him. This would lead to the modern Islamic Republic we see today. Iran quickly took an anti-Western and monarchist stance, which worried the US, but more importantly, angered Saudi Arabia. Why? Well, if you didn't know, Saudi Arabia is led by a monarch with an absolute power who's pro-Western. Two things the new Iranian regime hates. Let's start with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a kingdom in the middle of the Middle East, and like I said, it's an absolute monarchy, led by this king, whose name I can't really pronounce. Saudi Arabia has supported America's interests in the region since the Cold War. It has allowed the U.S. to place military bases in its territory, and has allowed U.S. to move troops through its territory to invade Iraq or something. The reason Saudi Arabia supports America is because in 1945, America made a deal with that Saudi Arabia would give the U.S. a steady stream of oil from Saudi Arabia's large supply to satisfy the USA's energy needs, which had made Saudi Arabia very rich. In exchange, the U.S. would provide Saudi Arabia state with security and funding. So Saudi Arabia tolerates the U.S. actions because if they didn't, they would suffer a revenue loss and would be without a backer, which leaves them in a dangerous position if Iran goes full gorilla monkey mode. This doesn't mean Saudi Arabia follows America's ideas for the Middle East. Actually, quite the opposite. Saudi Arabia supports the old order, in which absolute fundamentalist Islamic kingdoms were the norm in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia supports other kingdoms in the Middle East, from revolutions or Iran. Speaking of Iran, Iran is a country on the eastern edges of the Middle East. It's an Islamic republic led by the Supreme Leader, whose name I also can't pronounce. If the title Supreme Leader sounds undemocratic, then you'll be right, because the Supreme Leader has total control in Iran, with every political institution picked out by him. Like I said, Iran is anti-American and hates monarchies for obvious reasons. Iran aims to fill the Middle East with revolutionary republics who follow similar ideas to Iran's. And they do this by supporting rebel groups and governments that support Iran's ideals. The real start to the Cold War was when the Arab Spring happened, which were a series of anti-government protests, uprisings, and armed rebellions that collapsed many authoritarian regimes. This gave Iran the chance to support revolutionary groups and replace pro-Saudi regimes with pro-Iranian ones. But Saudi Arabia had other plans. You see, when the Arab Spring was happening, Saudi Arabia was fearing that the other monarchies would get the same treatment. So, Saudi Arabia deepened its ties with other monarchies in the region and formed a Gulf Union to cement Saudi Arabia's influence in the region. But this did not stop the nation of Syria from collapsing into a civil war. In March 2011, protests against Syria's dictatorial regime quickly turned into a rebellion after violent crackdowns from the government turned Syria into a battleground. Things got complicated when Turkey invaded and Islamic terrorists took over parts of the country. Iran quickly took action, supported the original government against the rebels, as the government is ruled by a revolutionary government. However, this was obviously opposed by Saudi Arabia and Turkey, which would proceed to support the pro-democratic forces. Saudi Arabia would. Turkey would support a government they created in its occupied territories that they captured from Syria. After years of conflict, it's become clear that the original Syria government, supported by Iran, is going to win. So that's a victory for Iran. Next is Yemen, who's also going through a civil war. You know, if I had a nickel, in 2014, a radical Shiite movement called the Houthis started uprising against the Yemenese government, quickly taking the capital and 1/3 of the country. The rest of the country was under the control of a coalition of pro-government and anti-Houthi forces. Saudi Arabia and the UAE came to the defense of the pro-government forces, while Iran obviously supported the Houthi government. The civil war, like Syria's, had continued to this day, with a ceasefire in the process. It looks like neither Saudi Arabia or Iran reached its goals, but I hope peace prevails. Iraq is this country right here. Iraq has been through a lot. A failed invasion of Iran, an international intervention to stop Iraq from destroying Kuwait, an American invasion and occupation, and an insurgency from a fundamentalist Islamic terrorist group called ISIS. With the population going through all this and starting to radicalize, and the government lacking proper security infrastructure, it's not surprising when extremist militia groups started to spring up all around the country, destabilizing the nation. These militia groups had a range of beliefs, but they had one thing in common: a pure hatred of America, which made it easy for Iran to get these militias on their side. But that wasn't Iran's only ally in Iraq, as Iraq itself had become a staunch ally to Iran. Iraq sided with Iran due to them helping the ISIS insurgency. But more importantly, the Iraq government was made up of anti-American officials. These officials were voted in by the Iraqi people because of their anti-American stances, as the Iraqs had suffered massively from the U.S. invasion and its brutal occupation. So when the U.S. set up a republic with free elections to replace the previously dictatorial Iraqi regime, and expected the people to vote for their candidates, the people voted in favor of those anti-American politicians. But that was back then, and now relations between Iraq and Iran are not so strong. The Iraq government has noticed Iran's influence in the nation and want to keep the Iraq government independent from Iran. Iran has also worsened relations by supporting dangerous militia groups to attack Saudi citizens and politicians living in the country, which destabilizes Iraq. Iraq has also noticed Iran's support for Kurdish rebels who want to make a separate state from Iraq called Kurdistan. All these actions has put a dent in Iran's relations with Iraq, and has turned many Iraqi militias away from them. But Iraq still considers them an important ally, but also has restored good relations with the U.S., as U.S. soldiers are now helping Iraq fight ISIS. This is so that Iraq could have American influence balance Iran's influence to keep Iran and America from not getting too much influence in Iraq. So Iraq is still Iran than Saudi Arabia, but they're mostly neutral in Middle Eastern war. Now I'll cut that In Qatar, the nation was once a strong Saudi ally, but has drifted away from Saudi Arabia to Iran. This all happened in 2017 when Saudi Arabia and its allies broke diplomatic ties to the nation when it was found out that Qatar was supporting a Islamic revolutionary group called the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. So now Qatar has, since 2017, has been on Iran's side in the Cold War. The Saudi-Iran Cold War has been going on for a long time now, and has been politically affecting the Middle East. So I hope this simplification of this complex conflict helped you to digest this, like how to understand why this is going on. Well, ciao.